Morning, everybody. So I'm really excited about this morning. We've got several brilliant people talking about what I think is a really important topic. First up, we have Emma Borg with the keynote talk. So Emma is perhaps most renowned for her work in philosophy of language, for example, her work on minimal semantics. But she also has uh, a range of really interesting, excellent work in a number of areas in philosophy of psychology, including some work about pain, some really interesting critical work about mirror neurons, which I personally think of as a really nice example of how to do interdisciplinary work. And most relevantly for today, her 2024 book, Acting for Reasons in Defense of Common Sense Psychology. So today Emma's going to talk to us about the question, do we do what we do for the reasons we have? Over to you.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, right. Well, thank you very much, James, for that incredibly kind introduction. And thank you also to all of the organisers, both for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted to be back at the ESPP again, and also for all the hard work behind the scenes. I know that putting on a conference of this kind of scale and complexity is a real job of work. So thank you to everybody for what's involved. And just to note, when I was looking at the programme last night, I noticed that this room is called the Hall of Mirrors. I don't know whether this is a European-wide thing, but certainly in the UK, we have a kind of fairground attraction called the Hall of Mirrors, which AI helpfully told me last night is a room designed to disorientate you, or metaphorically, a confusing situation where it's hard to distinguish truth from illusion. I don't know whether this was the organisers, worrying about the content of the presentation, but I'm going to hope that the name of the room is operating as a proper name and not some kind of definite description of what's about to come. Yeah, okay. Okay, so first of all, the plan for today's talk and the bit of shameless self-advertising. So as James said, I had a book come out. It came out officially in December 28th, 2024, but I'm counting it as kind of 2025, so I hope you don't mind me still talking about it here. It's called Acting for Reasons in Defense of Common Sense Psychology. And the first part of what I'm going to talk about today comes from the book. So if you're interested, if you want a bit more information, hopefully if you have a look at the book, you might find it there. But then I'm going to move on to some stuff that I kind of touch on in the book, but I'm going to try and expand a bit more in the later parts of the talk. So the plan then, I'm going to tell you about the view I want to defend, common sense psychology, what it is and why we might want it. That will be, I imagine, philosophy 101 for everybody here. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, we'll have a little look at what the theory tells us. Then I'm going to tell you what I think the problem is. There are lots and lots of problems out there, but the one we're going to focus on today is this worry that comes from the heuristics and biases program, the idea that a lot of what we do just isn't responsive to reasons at all. That's going to throw up this immediate question, which is, well, why should we think that heuristic-driven action is the kind of thing that doesn't look at reasons? I'm going to really quite briefly go through what I think are the four main arguments you can find for that claim in the literature, which appeal to speed, to unconsciousness, to a lack of working memory, and to an underpinning associative process. I'm going to try and tell you that none of those really show us that heuristics should be thought of as things that just don't look to reasons at all. But that's going to leave us with a further kind of question, which is, well, maybe if we don't think of heuristics like that, does that mean that really we should think that all action is generated by reasons? And I'm going to point back to a kind of older philosophical worry about skills and habits that interacts in an odd kind of way with some of the heuristics literature. But we'll look at someone who very recently has been proposing this as a reason to worry about common sense psychology, which is a book from Peter Carruthers very recently. And I'm going to give you some reasons to maybe not buy everything that Carruthers tells us, and then I'm going to conclude by saying we can defend the reach of common sense psychology. Okay, so let's get started then. So common sense psychology goes under a myriad of names: folk psychology, mind reading, a whole bunch of names: belief, desire, psychology, causal theory of reason, all getting at the same kind of core idea, I think, which is that when we're thinking about human action, we need to take this kind of mentalizing perspective, and we need to think about it as responding to the reasons that a person has. So in philosophy, much of the debate about common sense psychology has gone under the kind of rubric of thinking about action understanding. So it's thought about as a third person kind of account. How do I know what you're doing when I see a bit of behavior from you? Well, I do this kind of mentalizing thing where I think of you as having some mental states and operating in light of those mental states. So I see your hand moving in a certain kind of way, and I think to myself, you're reaching for the jar because you want a cookie and you believe there is one in the jar. But of course, the reason that it's supposed to work as an account of action understanding for others is that it's an account of action generation in general, so it also applies in the first person case. So I think that what I'm doing is also responsive to the reasons that I have, right? I'm reaching for the jar because I want a cookie and I think there's one in there. So common sense psychology has this kind of dual direction, and we're going to focus today just on this action generation question, just on the question about the way in which actions come about for an individual. And what I take to be core to the idea of common sense psychology is first that it offers this kind of mentalizing perspective. It thinks of reasons as mental states and takes those to be the things that you have to be sensitive to when you're acting. And it has this kind of integral assumption of individual rationality. It takes it that in general, what we do is a rational response to the reasons we have. Okay, so, I work out what I want and I work out a good plan for getting what I want. Okay, so why might we want that kind of model? It's traditional in philosophy, it's got a kind of orthodox status, but we might think, well, why do we actually want that kind of approach? Just because it's an orthodox isn't a good reason. But it seems as if this notion of reason's responsivity is absolutely core to a whole bunch of things that philosophers and I think psychologists also really care about, right? Notions like agency, the understanding of mental states in general, key to a notion of kind of what it is to be a person, and that's got outside academia, right? It's often thought that man is a kind of rational animal. That's what's important to us. So this idea that we're reasons responsive seems to be key to the kinds of things we think we are. And it's also key to a bunch of moral notions, right? So responsibility seems to turn on this idea that we do what we do for the reasons we have. And reactive attitudes like praise and blame seem appropriate just to the extent that we think someone is acting on their reasons. So it's an important kind of model. Junking the model is going to be very detrimental to a lot of things that we care about as philosophers, I think. Secondly, as Victoria McGeer has nicely put it, humans are just inveterate mentalizers, right? We find it really natural to take this kind of belief, desire, mentalizing stance to others. Maybe it's not always right to do it, but it comes very, very naturally to us. And I think it comes naturally to us just because it's an incredibly successful mode of explanation, right? So the philosophers in the room will all know that Churchland spent a long time telling us that common sense psychology is a bankrupt theory. It doesn't fit with the, concerns of natural sciences, and it doesn't do a good explanatory job. But I think Churchland's claim only came about because he was ignoring the kind of vast swathe of totally quotidian explanatory and predictive moves we make that depend on common sense psychology. So if I had a bit longer here, I would give you a nice long quote from Fodor, who puts the point much more eloquently than I can. But Fodor, in a bunch of places, talks about the defense of common sense psychology, and he gives us this nice example where he says, look, imagine an exchange between A and B. All that happens is A says, would you like to lecture here next Tuesday? And B says, yes, I'll be at your airport on the 3 p.m. flight. And that is enough to allow this incredible coordination of behavior so that a week later or a month later or a year later, depending on how you set up the example, their A is at the airport and their B is to collect him. And that should be something that really impresses us, right? And as Fodor points out, if something goes wrong, if one of them's not there, it's more likely that there's been some kind of mechanical failure, that the airline's on strike or the car has broken down, than that the belief desire psychology has failed. So he writes, the theory from which we get this extraordinary predictive power is just good old common sense belief desire psychology. If we could do that well with predicting the weather, no one would ever get his feet wet. And yet the etiology of the weather must surely be child's play compared with the causes of behavior. So there's Jerry doing his nice hyperbolic kind of thing, but I think he's right. We should be impressed by the power that this theory gives us. So we should want to hang on to it if we can. But the worry is that it doesn't look like we can hang on to it because once we get out of our philosophical armchairs and we go and do some experiments about the way that people are making decisions and coming to actions, it starts looking as if the kind of reasons-based model is just over-intellectualizing what people actually do. So the kind of locus classicus for this kind of argument comes from the heuristics and biases program, which tells us that a whole lot of what we get up to is not driven by our reasons, but is driven by these kinds of broader environmental, non-reason-giving facts. So here's a case we might look at. So I'm in a snack shop, there are apples and sweets available to me, and I end up buying an apple, and we might ask ourselves, well, why did I do that? Why have I walked out of the shop holding an apple? According to common sense psychology, the answer lies in the kinds of mental states that I've taken into the situation. I bought the apple because I want to eat well, and I believe that apples are better for me than sweets, maybe. So that's a common sense psychology kind of explanation. But as we all know, there's a different kind of explanation in the offing here, which many people find compelling, which is that I just bought the apple because it's there in my eye line and the sweets were kind of hidden away on a lower level, and that's what explains my behavior. And that kind of explanation just appeals to these kinds of broader environmental facts. It takes my behavior to be driven by this environmental trigger, not by my beliefs and desires. And we can see that right through experimental work. I don't know where the quote is. Because if we do experiments where we change the location of the apple and the sweets, we switch them around, it turns out you sell more apples when the apples are in eye line, and you sell more sweets when sweets are in eye line. But presumably someone's kind of standing beliefs and desires are going to remain constant across those purely kind of environmental manipulations. So it looks as if that's the case, where what I'm doing is driven by an environmental trigger, and it's insensitive to the kinds of things I believe and desire. So according to the heuristics and biases program that focuses on this kind of thing, what's happening is my actions are being driven by this system one, heuristic-based kind of responding, using something like maybe cognitive availability, go with the thing that's most salient to you, or maybe take the first thing that looks like a good solution to your problem, some kind of rough and ready heuristic that's insensitive to reasons. Or again, here's an absolute classic case that I'm going to take it maybe 100%, maybe 99.9% of people in the room have seen before, but I'll give it to you just because it's such a classic. So Kahneman and Tversky gave their experimental subjects a little vignette. They told people Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Given that, which is more probable, that Linda is a bank teller, or that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? If you haven't, by some chance, ever seen this before, you can have a go at it now, and I'm going to guess that the answer you want to give is 2. It's just more probable that she's a bank teller and a feminist than a bank teller alone. But, of course, if you've taken Logic 101, you're going to know that that can't be the logical answer, right? Because a conjunct of 2 claims A and B can never be more probable than one of the conjuncts A on its own. So logically, you ought to give the answer 1, but we all feel this kind of gut drive to want to say 2 here. So that looks like a case where we're doing something wrong. We're not responding to reasons in the way that common sense psychology suggests we ought to be. So Thaler and Sunstein, writing about this case, write as follows. The error here stems from the use of the representativeness heuristic. Linda's description seems to match bank teller and active in the feminist movement far better than bank teller alone. As Stephen Jay Gould once observed, I know the right answer, yet a little homunculus in my head continues to jump up and down, shouting at me, but she can't just be a bank teller, read the description. Gould's homunculus is the automatic system in action. Okay, so there's this idea again that what we're doing is not responsive to kind of proper logical reasoning. What's happening is just some kind of gut feel, appeal to a stereotype, run with that, don't engage your reasoning faculties. Okay, so that's where the literature gets us, I think. It gets us to a bunch, and I've given you 2 cases here. I could have given you thousands of more. The literature is absolutely stuffed with cases where we have experiments that seem to show we're responding in this automatic, heuristic-y kind of way, not in a proper reasons-based way. But I think the argument that that we're not doing the right thing here is often a little bit slippery, and it's not entirely clear what the problem is supposed to be from heuristics for common sense psychology. So I think there are a bunch of challenges that we might have in mind here, and the one I want to focus on today, I think, is the most robust version of a challenge from heuristics. And it says that what's happening when you're relying on heuristic is that you're just not looking to reasons at all. You're not in the sphere of asking for reasons or consulting evidence. What you're doing is just allowing some totally gut feel response to lead you to your answer. So this is what I call the no reasons challenge. Some action generation simply does not consult reasons at all. Very often we simply don't bother looking for evidence or weighing up reasons. We just go with this automated system one response. So I've got a quote here from John Doris, who's very taken with this version of heuristics. He says, look, often behavior is influenced by a process that the actor is unaware of and would not recognize as a reason justifying the behavior were she so aware. Here, reason is not overwhelmed, but somehow bypassed. Okay, so it's the idea that we're just not getting into the sphere of reasons. We're just doing some kind of brute environmental triggering. Okay, just as an aside, I think it's important to hold that apart from a kind of closely related objection, which is to think that heuristics are about responding to evidence, but they're doing so in a kind of poor way. They're not looking at enough evidence, or they're not reasoning on that evidence appropriately. That is a very different kind of objection, and it requires a very different kind of response. And I think a worry I have with the literature here is that those two challenges often get run together, but I think it's really important to try and keep them apart. So today we're just going to focus on this really robust no reasons version of heuristics. But I think that should immediately raise the question for you, well, why should we think of heuristics in that way? Why should we accept that heuristics and heuristic-driven action is just not looking to reasons and reasoning at all? And I think in the literature you can find four main reasons that are given to you for that. First one appeals to the speed of the reasoning. Okay, maybe gut feels just come to us so fast there can't be any space for looking at reasons. Maybe it's because there's something unconscious going on here. The process is one we're not aware of, so it can't be reasoned. Maybe it's to do with a lack of working memory, a slightly more kind of technical worry, and maybe it's because these relations rely on association. So I'm going to go kind of a bit quickly through all of these 4 points, but I'm going to suggest to you that none of them suffice to show that heuristics are reasons insensitive in the strong sense. Okay, so let's start with speed then. You would be absolutely forgiven for thinking that speed is the defining feature that you need to focus on here, not least because Kahneman's massively influential public-facing book was entitled Thinking, Fast and Slow. That makes it look a lot like the speed of the thinking is the thing that's holding things apart here. But in fact, even if you look at advocates of heuristics and biases, there's been a move relatively recently, I think, to distance themselves from this kind of claim. But anyway, I think it was there at one time. So the argument is really easy. Reasoning and deliberation is slow. A lot of action generation is fast. Therefore, a lot of action generation can't involve reasoning. So the objection I have to this kind of claim is just that it seems to me that these kinds of qualitative properties of our decision-making processes, so things like speed, also things like ease, those kinds of properties just dissociate in both directions from the kind of decision-making process that's in play. So I'll try and give you some evidence to believe that. I think there's a double dissociation because things that are clearly heuristic rules, these kinds of rough and ready rules of thumb, can definitely be used in a more reflective, slow, deliberative kind of way. So, you know, think about the Linda case a minute ago. You might have had a grabby, quick, immediate kind of response, but you could have used the same process in a much slower, more deliberative kind of way. You could have thought to yourself, you know, I just really don't know what the answer to this question is, but you've just spent a whole lot of time telling me about how well Linda fits my stereotype of being a feminist, so, you know, you must have been, you know, that must be doing some work here, so I should take it that, you know, it's more likely that she's a feminist. You're trying to tell me something about her being a feminist. That appeals to a stereotype, but it does so in a much more, you know, reflective, deliberative kind of way. Okay, but the point I really want to stress is just the flip side, that it just seems a massive assumption to think that logical rules and logical reasoning has to take place slowly and effortfully. Okay, because I just think we've got a lot of evidence that we use logical rules in ways that deliver quick and easy results in just the way that heuristic-based rules do. So take a little toy case. If I tell you that Maya ate fish and drank beer, and then I ask you, did Maya drink beer? Assuming you think I'm asking you that question sensibly, I'm going to guess that that answer comes to you pretty easily and pretty quickly. But the rule by which you're getting that answer is conjunction elimination. And that's a rule of logic, right? That's not a heuristic. So it looks as if speed of decision-making comes apart from kind of rule in play. And luckily, we don't have to just rely on our own kind of, or my intuitions about the way the evidence is going to go here, because there seems to be some experimental evidence that this is right. Okay, so Wim de Nys has done a lot of nice experiments in this area. He's an advocate of the dual process, heuristic-y kind of model. But even so, his experimental work seems to show that speed is not the key issue here, because he shows that even in complex cases, using the kinds of cases that heuristics and biases people like to appeal to, we still get, for at least some people, the logical response being their quickest response. So de Nys concentrates particularly on the cognitive reflection test, the CRT. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. The most famous case is the bat and ball. I haven't given you that one. Another case, which I have put on the slide, is the lily pad case. So you tell people that a lily pad doubles in size every day. After 48 days, it covers the whole lake. And then you ask them on what day did it cover half the lake. The logical answer there is 47, but you find a non-negligible amount of people want to say 24, just because 48 divides so neatly into 24, basically halving it. Okay, so there we've got, again, the pull apart between an intuitive answer and a logical answer. But what de Nys found is that if you give people a CRT-type question and you ask them to give two answers, one as absolutely fast as they possibly can and one after an enforced period of deliberation, it turns out that almost everybody who gives you the logical answer after the period of enforced deliberation also gave you the logical answer as their fastest possible response. And what that seems to show is that for at least some people, the logical response here just is their quick, immediate response. So I think that we should hold on to this idea that speed of processing doesn't tell us something about kind of processing, because speed is dependent on a whole range of kind of contingent features about the nature of the task, how abstract or difficult it is, the kind of person you are, how used you are to dealing with logical problems, whether or not you've had a cup of coffee, a whole bunch of things that are going to be relevant to how fast you come up with your answer. So I don't think speed is going to do it. How are we doing here? Let's speed up a bit. What about consciousness? So I think there's philosophical precedent for thinking that consciousness is the defining factor of reasoning versus unreasoning here. Because for many people, to be a reason just is to be a thing that's appearing at the first personal level, right? For an act to be done for a reason, to be a rational act, the thought is S must be consciously aware of the reason for which they're acting and aware of its kind of reason-giving role. They've got to be acting in the light of a reason. And that looks like a claim about conscious awareness. But of course, lots of what we do is done unreflectively and unconsciously. So if that assumption is right, it's going to turn out that lots of what we do is not done for a reason. So I think there's a lot to say about this objection, and I'm not going to focus on it too much. But I think one worry we might have might come from the nature of consciousness itself. There's an assumption built into this argument that consciousness, James and I were talking about this the other day, consciousness is a bit like a light switch, you switch it on or off. I'm a bit skeptical about that model of consciousness. I think we might need a more graded kind of picture where we have kind of fringe states of consciousness, things that aren't fully unconscious but maybe aren't fully conscious either. But if we had that kind of model, we couldn't use consciousness, unconsciousness to give a binary divide between reasons and unreasoning unless we had, a reason to draw a line somewhere on that scale. But we don't have any reason given to us by the advocates of heuristics and biases. So if we have this graded model, I think that's a problem for them. But I think the point I really want to put pressure on here, and I'm hoping it's going to be something that may come up again in the symposium later on, is that, we shouldn't be drawing the border for reasons-based transitions at the border of consciousness, because lots of ordinary kinds of cases that we need to incorporate within common sense psychology are going to appeal to dispositional states, things that aren't currently conscious to an individual. So, you know, imagine I ask you, is the Earth flat? You may be able to answer that question and say, no, the Earth isn't flat, without first having to drag up your beliefs about the state of the world. Something that's a purely dispositional state can immediately play a role in providing your answer to the question here. Or again, think about the cognitive flexibility of kind of plan execution. So imagine that I'm making a cup of tea, I'm English, so I take milk in my tea, but I'm having a really interesting conversation with Eric about the nature of consciousness as I'm doing it, so I'm not really focusing on what I'm doing. I start moving towards the fridge, and Eric says, oh, by the way, I've drunk all your milk, there's nothing left in there, or, you know, maybe the milk's on the side already. What he tells me will immediately influence the kinds of actions I'm undertaking, right? I'll stop my fridge-orienting behavior, I'll start walking towards the side, or I'll stop making tea if he really has drunk it all, you know. I will change what I'm doing given purely propositional information about the state of the world that I'm operating in. And that kind of integration, I think, shows us that, you know, the stuff that's happening without full conscious reflection is still perfectly structured, perfectly reasons responsive, even though it's not receiving full conscious awareness. Okay, so I don't think that consciousness is going to draw apart reasoning from unreasoning for us either. What about working memory? So this is a kind of slightly more technical move, and it's been made by some big figures in the heuristics and biases field. So Jonathan Evans and Keith Stanovich both think that working memory is going to be the point at which we can tell apart the operation of a heuristic from the operation of a reasoning process. So the argument, again, is a nice simple one. Claim is going to be reasoning requires working memory. Heuristics don't require working memory, so heuristics are not involving reasons or reasoning. So then we want to know, well, why should we think that heuristics don't require working memory? What's the evidence for this second kind of claim? And again, we're going to look to the experimental work, right? We're going to think that something in the experiments shows us that heuristics are not requiring working memory. So the thought is that if you give someone a concurrent working memory task, you load on their working memory, then what we should find is that if heuristics don't require working memory, rates of heuristic-based responding go up, rates of logical responding go down, because you haven't got the kind of bandwidth for doing the reasoning here, because reasoning relies on working memory, and you've used it all up doing your other working memory task. And this is exactly what Deneys found in a couple of experiments, right? He found that if you got people to memorize a dot display or hum a pre-learned tune, something that's requiring working memory resource, what you find is that fewer subjects give the logical response in the Linda case. Okay, so more people tell you that she's a bank teller and a feminist. Less people tell you that she's just a bank teller. And in the Wason selection task, again, I'll take it most people are familiar with, you find that fewer subjects get the logically correct cards. So here's the Wason task on the board. Don't know if you can see the colours. Yeah, maybe you can. The Wason task, you get 4 cards. You'll get told that there's a number on one side and a colour on the other. And you get asked which cards do you need to turn over to test the rule that if a number is odd, the other side is red. I'll leave it to you guys to try and work out what you need to turn over, but it turns out that most people get this wrong, at least on first blush. It's quite a difficult abstract kind of task, and people are just not very good at abstract conditional reasoning, this test seems to show us. Okay, so those results look good for this idea that working memory shows us that heuristics don't rely on reasoning and logical processes do, because you get worse at doing these kinds of things or giving a logical answer to these kinds of things when you've got an additional working memory task. But I think we should worry about this argumentative move, because I think it turns out that the use of working memory is, much like the things I wanted to say about speed, going to be dependent on a whole range of kind of contingent task and context features. So my hunch is that if Deneys had run his kind of experiments with some simpler logical tasks, you wouldn't have seen very much in the way of a drop-off in performance levels. So if you ran my Maya ate fish and drank beer, did she drink beer kind of case, while asking people to memorize a dot display, my guess is, particularly if you can minimize the verbal or the linguistic load on that, if you present it by a picture, say, you're not going to see much of a drop-off in performance when you get people to do something else with working memory. That's my hunch, but again, we don't have to rely on just my hunch, because we've got experimental evidence that seems to show that's the case. Because as we all know, if you run a practical version of the Wason task, right, you up the ecological validity of the experiment, you make it something that's more practical, more applied to an agent's life, people get much, much better at it. So if you use the Griggs and Cox version here, where you ask about drinking ages, you give people cards that have ages on one side and kinds of drinks on the other, and you say, you know, which cards do I have to turn over to test that this establishment is abiding by the rule that if someone's drinking alcohol, then they're above the legal age limit? People have no problem with doing that. They're much, much better at it. But presumably the rule that's going on there is a bit of logical reasoning. It's still conditional reasoning. It's just much easier for people. And you don't get, what Danae's found is that you don't get this drop-off in performance with that kind of task when someone's doing a dot display or humming a memorized tune. And I think it's interesting that in the experiments where Danae did see a major drop-off, that was the Linda case and the Wason task. And those two tasks are already pretty much at ceiling, right? Almost everybody will tell you that Linda is both a bank teller and a feminist. Almost everybody will get the Wason task wrong unless they've done some logic. And I think if you tried this kind of experiment with less ceiling type tasks, you might see a very different kind of picture. So I want to suggest that this kind of finding about practical Wason tasks suggests that there can be cases where you use logical rules and yet they don't degrade under working memory load. And secondly, I think we should think of working memory as a graded kind of capacity where tasks require more or less working memory. It's not an all or nothing kind of thing. And we might think that heuristic-based responding still requires some working memory, even if it's less working memory than a bit of logical reasoning. And this is a point that Danae himself makes, right? He says, from a theoretical point of view, it is not unwarranted to assume that correctly solving the practical Wason task might require some executive resources. Dual process theories take it for granted that reasoning on the basis of stored background knowledge is completely automatic. However, even in the drinking age problem, reasoners will still have to access their long-term memory to retrieve the knowledge that 14-year-olds are not supposed to drink. So this is just to notice that for all kinds of decision-making operations, there's likely to be background conditions that you have to bring into play, and it's just an assumption that seems to be made here that those background conditions are not going to require working memory. But that seems like an assumption that would need argument for. So I think what we have is a spectrum of working memory demand, from resource-light cases to resource-heavy, and that kind of demand is going to be influenced by a whole range of factors, like familiarity with the problem, how abstract or concrete the problem is, how difficult or easy the problem is, whether the person is under time pressure or not. All of that is going to influence in a way that's independent of the kind of decision-making rule that's in play. So I think there's no argument, I think, for claiming we can draw a line somewhere on that working memory grade and claiming that it marks a switch between two totally different kinds of decision-making process, moving from something that doesn't appeal to any reasons to something that does appeal to reasons. Okay. So the last argument I think you can find in the literature, and I'm just going to sketch an answer to this because I want to get on to the next point really, is an appeal to the kind of process that a heuristic is. So there's a thought that a heuristic-based process is an associative process, and associative processes are not sensitive to reasons. Now, I think that turns on a lot of assumptions about what the nature of association is, turns on the thought that maybe there's just one kind of association and it's always this kind of brute environmental triggering, and that may just not be right. So I think there's a lot we want to say about this point. I'm not really going to go into it right now, because the point I just want to push, I think, is that associative responses are kind of fully enmeshed, usually, within a subject's wider cognitive environment. So they're sensitive to propositional content, both at the point of formation and at the point of commencement or closure. So, if you think about some cases of implicit bias, where you're learning an implicit bias, you learn it because of the way you're conceptualizing the situation, because of the information you're given about the target in some cases. So it's sensitive to the way that you're thinking about the situation. And as colleagues in the front row have very helpfully pointed out, it's definitely sensitive to propositional claims at the point of either commencement or closure. So, you can create an implicit bias, say, against members of a fictional basketball team by telling people about how bad this basketball team is and the fact that they cheat and showing them examples of this team cheating. And you might think that that then becomes a totally kind of automated process that's triggered just by bumping into a member of your fictional basketball team. But it turns out that if you tell people, if you see someone wearing one of these basketball jumpers, but if they've got a, purple hat on, they're actually, infiltrating the team and they're trying to find out why it's gone badly wrong, so they're not the bad guys, then the association doesn't get triggered. People are sensitive to that kind of propositional information. And I think that kind of integration shows us that in the typical case, associations are well integrated with our wider cognitive framework. And indeed, we can understand what's going on in certain cases of cognitive decline just in terms of a breakdown between associative relations and a wider cognitive framework. So, in cases of dementia, if someone finds themselves going into a room and brushing their hair when what they meant to do was go in and get a jumper, what's gone wrong there is that they've been triggered into an associative bit of behavior that no longer fits with their overall goals or doesn't fit with their overall goals at that time. But that's just to demonstrate that most of the time, in the typical case, our associative behaviors play a part in our wider cognitive lives, right? They're integrated with the things we want and the things we desire in the proper kind of reasons-based way. Okay, so that gets us through the first 2/3 of the talk. We've only got a little bit left to go. What I want to do as my midway conclusion, or my 2/3 way conclusion, is tell you that we should reject this kind of no reasonsy view of heuristics. Maybe it's right that heuristics look to reasons in a different kind of way to laws of logic, but they're not things that lie right outside the sphere of reasons. They're things that are integrated within our reasons-given behavior. So I want to say action generation can be driven by a kind of rule of thumb heuristic rather than a rule of logic, and it can occur quickly, unconsciously, involving limited working memory resources and based on association, but none of that entails that it's not reason sensitive. None of that shows you that it's just a case of brute environmental triggering, which is independent of any reasons. So I think it's wrong to think that heuristic-based responding is necessarily impervious to or bypasses all reasons and reasoning, and we should reject the heuristic-based version of the no reasons challenge. Okay, so that's kind of a potted history of what I do in the first, 2/3 half of the book. But what I've been thinking about recently is the question that I just touched on in the book about whether or not that shows us that we should think of all action as sensitive to reason. All action is driven by response to reason. Okay, so that's what Davidson told us. Davidson said intentional action can just be defined as reason-sensitive action. But there's a long philosophical tradition of thinking that that kind of move isn't right. So, if you think of William James telling us about habit, it seemed that he thought that there was lots of the kinds of things that we did that don't rely on reasons. Lots of intentional things, things that I do, not just done to me, things that genuinely I do, but which I don't do for reasons. And I think it's an interesting question how this kind of point relates to the heuristics and biases literature, because the heuristics and biases literature certainly do talk in terms of habits and gut feels and affect and things, but they also have these kinds of weird logical examples like the Linda case, and we might wonder how they all fit together, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. I'm just going to go back to this kind of more traditional philosophical question about, well, what about habits and skills? Are they the kinds of things that we think should fall within the common sense framework of giving and asking for reasons? And helpfully, it turns out that there's a very recent philosopher, a very recent book, that takes exactly this kind of issue to heart, right? So it's a bit like buses. You wait for one book on common sense psychology to come along, and then almost immediately two come along, because this is Carruthers' Explaining Our Actions, a critique of common sense theorizing. This came out like 4 weeks ago in August, I think, so, don't quote me on everything I say about it, because I may not have quite got it right yet, but I'm going to give you my take on what I think is going on here. It's a little bit hard sometimes to see what Carruthers' target exactly is, but I'm going to take it that since I'm defending common sense psychology, that falls under the kind of common sense theory that he doesn't really like. And I should say there is lots in the book that is really, really great, and lots that I agree with, so it's definitely worth taking a look at, but I have a problem with this kind of overall framing that he adopts. So here's Carruthers on habits. He says, consider someone who habitually sets about making coffee when they first enter the kitchen in the morning. In the early stages of habit formation, this requires thought and decision-making, but it no longer does. An initiating cue, stepping into the kitchen and turning on the light, automatically triggers the next stage in the process. There need have been no prior thoughts of coffee drinking, either conscious or unconscious, nor was any decision taken to make coffee. Rather, the contextual cue initiated a well-rehearsed associative sequence. So for Carruthers, that is a case that falls outside common sense psychology, as does a skills-based case. So he says skilled action is representational through and through. It is flexible, responding swiftly to changes in circumstances, costs, and opportunities. Indeed, it gives every appearance of a kind of low-level intelligence, utilizing processes within sensory motor systems that closely resemble unreflective forms of decision-making. It is certainly not mindless, unless one equates mind with conscious mind. Yet most skilled actions fall outside the scope of the standard belief-desire model of action explanation. Okay, so in both of those quotes, Carruthers is stressing the flexibility and kind of cognitive integration of our skilled and habitual behaviors. But if you've managed to stay awake and you can remember just a couple of slides back, I was stressing cognitive integration and flexibility as showing us that actually these cases fell within our reasons-based environment. So, why does Carruthers hold this view? Why does he think that you have flexibility and integration, but you don't have something that can be explained by our reasons-based model? Well, I think the answer is largely because he's also relying on this kind of very brain-based picture of how we do what we do. So he thinks that there are just these clear different neural pathways involved in our activities. He says intentions and goals, the kinds of things that common sense psychology deals with, take place or are stored in the anterior prefrontal cortex, and when activated, they create downstream activity in premotor and motor cortices. Skills and habits, on the other hand, involve networks linking motor cortices with subcortical networks in the striatum and the cerebellum. And he thinks there are two kinds of affect. There's a kind of goalie type affect, which occurs in the prefrontal cortex, and then there's this much more kind of gutsy feeling, which occurs in subcortical evaluative circuits, which are different to the prefrontal stuff. And then what he thinks is, okay, well, when you have a bit of kind of common sense psychology, reasons-based activity, that's mirrored by something going on in your prefrontal cortex, but activity just in these motor cortices can lead to action. And when that happens, what you've got is a non-reasons-based, purely environmentally triggered bit of behavior. So in response to this, I think the advocate of common sense psychology should just step back and ask herself what common sense psychology really requires. So Carruthers seems to think that any action which doesn't involve activation of a prior intention is something that falls outside of common sense psychology. So take the following kind of case. I should say there's a little wriggle about this kind of case that I'm not going to go through now for purposes of time, but there's definitely a further step that I would need to make to use this in the way that I want to. But anyway, here's a nice case, I think. So Carruthers writes, imagine that I believe the grass is too long and I want to cut it, but my partner tells me that lunch is ready. So I form the intention, cut the grass after lunch. Good intention. Then maybe the act of putting things away post-lunch can just cue the attention into action in such a way that one immediately heads down to the garage to collect the mower and get started on the mowing with no further thought. So that looks like a case that for Carruthers should fall outside common sense psychology because there's no prior activation of the intention, no prefrontal activity to show us that this is reasons-based. But I think the advocate of common sense psychology should just question the extent to which that kind of prior activation is really needed. Because once we allow that dispositional states are going to play a role, we need an account within common sense psychology that says, look, standing intentions can properly influence your behavior without needing to be called to mind every time they do that. And I think it's interesting to note that in the book, Carruthers talks very favorably about Bratman and Bratman's account of intentions, which seems absolutely right. It's a great account and we all need it. But if you look at Bratman, he has an account of what he calls a policy intention, which is a standing intention that doesn't need to be realized every time it influences action. And indeed, he even thinks that very kind of reflexy type actions like catching a ball when it's thrown at you may result from a kind of broad policy that you have, like, I should try and catch things that look like they've been intentionally thrown at me. And if that's right, if those kinds of cases count, then these kinds of cases are going to fall within our reasons-based model of action generation, even if there's no immediate activation of the intention that's relevant. And certainly, I think nothing in these kinds of cases undermines what I've been taking to be the fundamental claim of common sense psychology, which is this claim of kind of individual rationality for action generation. Okay, I've got, I think, one and a half more slides. So I think what I would like to say to you that's going wrong in these kinds of cases is an assumption of a dual process kind of nature of processing here. So we know from Kahneman and Tversky that, and almost everybody in the heuristics and biases literature, that the model is one of these two very different processes or systems for arriving at action generation. You've got your system one, automatic, gutsy, associative, heuristic-based, bypassing reason kind of process, and you've got your rational, difficult, deliberate, slow process that gets wheeled in when association goes wrong. Carruthers, even though he's got a very different kind of motivation and very different kinds of approaches, he's still got this kind of very dual processy model going on, right? It's actually three processes, because thinking about affect, but if we ignore affect cases for a minute, it's dual process. He thinks that there's this system one, which is motor control, directly stimulus triggered, automatic, non-rational, initiated entirely by the sensory motor system. Different kind of process, system two, your executive control system, using beliefs and desires, rational action generation, initiated by stuff going on in the prefrontal cortex. But I think rather than that kind of very divided dual process model, what I would like to advocate for is a much more messy, much more graded, much more kind of integrated picture of action generation. So this is the really speculative end. What I want to suggest to you is that maybe there really are genuinely intentional actions, things that I do rather than that get done to me, where they are entirely stimulus triggered. So maybe scratching an itch might be an example, laughing when you're tickled might be an example. Maybe there are things that I am doing, but they are fully stimulus triggered, not responsive to reasons. And there are definitely actions which are fully reasoned, right? Things that we deliberate about, take our time about, bring to full consciousness, reflect on. But we shouldn't think of those two things as different systems, right? We should think of those as poles on a general kind of reasons-based response that we can make, where we can have more or less reasoned behavior. So I think there's going to be a bundle of properties, things like cognitive integration, conscious awareness, working memory load, type of rule in play, brain regions involved, All of these things are going to influence the degree to which a bit of action generation counts as reasons responsive. And I might just note that that fits, I think, with the way that common sense tends to think about these notions, right? We have a notion of diminished responsibility, which tells you not that you have no responsibility, but that something about your reasons and your reasoning has gone wrong. So we have this idea of graded kind of reasons responsiveness. But what I want to hang on to is the claim that common sense psychology, this idea of reasons reflexiveness, goes a long way down the scale from the fully reflective stuff towards the really unreasoned behavior. And in particular, I think the reasons responsive model can accommodate much action generation that comes about fast, unconsciously, associatively, and as a result of dispositional, propositional states. So it can accommodate habitual behaviors which don't require explicit occurrent activation of a prior intention. Okay, so that's gone on a bit long, so I apologize, but just to conclude, I tried to suggest in the first part of the talk that we should reject the heuristics-based no reasons version of the challenge to common sense psychology. We should accept that heuristic-driven action can occur fast, without conscious awareness, with a low working memory demand, and via an associative process, but none of that should lead us to conclude that it's not behavior that's sensitive to reasons. And in the last part, I suggested to you that an advocate of common sense psychology could accept that there are some genuinely intentional actions which are not driven by reason. Maybe catching a ball is like that, maybe a habit that's become entirely divorced from the intentional states that instigated it. We can argue about what kinds of cases might look good there, but I think she could accept that there really are some cases that fall in that bucket. But I think that would leave unscathed the claim that common sense psychology provides the right model in general for human behavior. So nothing about heuristics or about habits or about skill per se, I want to say to you, undermines the claim that in general we do indeed do what we do for the reasons that we have. Okay, thanks.